Okay, welcome back to the 90's Rewind, and tonight we're going proper rock and roll. I know we're going proper rock and roll because we're backstage. And when you say backstage, you imagine, riders, you imagine groupies, you imagine everything else. You don't imagine being in the kitchen at the Brook in Ramsbottom. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Tom this evening. Good evening.
Good evening.
Welcome to Rossendale Radio. Now listen, this is very much about what gigging's about, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about being backstage is we did a gig up in Scotland a couple of years ago, and the support band, or a local band, they kept on leaving. We were in the snooker room, actually. That's what they were using, as the kind of room for the bands to hang out with, and they kept on leaving the door open. And I had to keep on closing the door, and I was trying to explain to them that you kind of want the audience to think it's like ancient Rome backstage, when in fact it's just a load of middle-aged blokes eating crisps. So you kind of don't. You want to maintain that kind of idea. Upstairs, downstairs, you want that idea that, there might be backlight and delights going on backstage, just not a lot of people eating crisps.
You could have. I was going to go with the romance of the fact that you wanted some stuff that needed to be chucked out and the congealed fat of the fryer, but clearly that wasn't part of the deal. But you're here tonight. You're going to be playing some songs that we'll know, some solo tracks that maybe people not necessarily so familiar with, and of course, let's start at that moment where, of course, you were in one of the biggest bands of the 90's, the Spiral Carpets, lead singer. Just take us back to that time at the beginning of the 90's. What was the kind of feeling like at the band? What was the moment that you as a band realised, something's happening here? We're going to be, we're hitting the charts. It's we're getting some traction out there.
I mean, I think the trouble with it is that back in the late 80s, it's sort of 89, when I joined, obviously being a singer before me, but I think they'd done a bit of work, but it started accelerating quite a lot in 89. But I think that the trouble is that at that time there really was a mainstream culture and kind of subcultures, and I suppose we were a subculture, whereas it's much harder to be like that now because of the internet and social media. So I think we knew the trajectory we were on. It's just that the big record companies or the big hotshots couldn't really see the way that things were going, but we could. So I suppose we were always running a little bit in advance of where everyone else's head was. So everyone else was playing catch up. So I don't think there was a moment where we realised it, because we'd already realised it 9 months before anyone else have. If you'd been in a less successful band, you probably might have felt it when single went in at number 14 in the charts with This Is How It Feels. But I think we'd already been feeling it for a year.
And it was the start of what essentially defined the decade, wasn't it? Because, we moved into Britpop, into that kind of middle section in 94, 95. But, those bands wouldn't have existed or wouldn't have had the traction if it hadn't have been for those, what got labelled as the Manchester bands. The bands from this area, did you feel that you were kind of, on a bit of a revolution? Or was it just that you were just playing music and glad that people were enjoying it?
I don't know. I joined in Spirals in 1989, but they've been sort of doing stuff in one form or another since 1985 really, or 1986, and it was a pretty long haul really. It wasn't, it takes, there's that cliche, isn't it, that it takes years and years to be an overnight success. So I think there was a suggestion that it was an anti-fashion and it wasn't part of the mainstream, like I said before. So I think it was more like, like in Spiral Carpets, they were kind of, they were quite different from a lot of the other bands that have been around before. I mean, like Clint, he had a kind of 60s haircut, kind of Peter Tork haircut in Oldham in 1984, 85, and you get beaten up for that kind of stuff. So, I mean, it's easy now for people to dress up and have different identities, but I'm not sure it was in Oldham in 1984. So I think, so what I'm saying is I think that the bands existed in despite of what was considered popular, the bands, whether it's Happy Mondays or Stone Roses or Spiral Carpets, they kind of existed completely in their own kind of gravity, and I think they were separate from what was mainstream at that time and almost hated what was, I think probably got succor and got kind of strength from being adversarial and being against what was popular culture at that time.
Usually with all our guests, we've asked you to choose the playlist tonight. We opened with a bit of Cannonball the Breeders, which I was over the moon about. It's one of my favourite tracks of the 90's, full stop. What made you choose that one?
It's good to see female-fronted bands and bands with women in them, without it being a tokenistic thing.
It's a hell of a bass line on that track as well.
She's very talented, obviously, and her role in the Pixies is very important as well. But, I think it's just, I don't know, they were quite kick-ass, weren't they? And I think, it's just, you know, there's always this thing in guitar music or rock and roll music, all the kind of prejudices that it ought to be played by white men. I mean, obviously I'm a white man, but it's, you know, it can't be played by people who are black. I mean, rock and roll was invented by, you know, and Ike Turner did Little Rocket, you know, 88 or whatever it was, you know. But so, and you know, women can't play rock and roll. It's complete garbage, you know. Rock and roll is all about people who are sort of fighting to represent their identity. So, you know, you should have some women in there playing kick-ass sort of rock and roll.
And we're leading in now. We're going to play a little bit of Pavement, which is taking us in another direction again. A sort of late 90's now. Pavement, big favourite.
I mean, I think I quite like Pavement because I was in a band with Steve Hanley from The Fall for about 12 years, and he always professed a dislike for Pavement because he thought they sounded like The Fall. So it's always good to put something in to upset your friends and colleagues. But I think there's such conformity in America versus, say, Britain. In Britain, we're much more eccentric and we're encouraged to be a lot more eccentric, whereas in America, it's harder for people to be adversarial and eccentric. So when you do get those bands, you know, that are like Pavement, they're even sweeter because they're fighting against conformity. There's much more conformity in, say, North America. You know, if you look at bands like LCD Sound System and the kind of stuff that they sing about, it's not the same as what Pavement was sung about, but it's kind of attacking this behemoth of sort of mainstream crappy culture, I think, and I think Pavement are doing that as well. And going on about Geddy Lee and all that kind of stuff is brilliant, you know, it's because it's the same thing that Devo were doing. Like Devo did a song called, the punk band Devo did a song called Uncontrollable Urge, and it's basically Dazed and Confused by Led Zeppelin sped up, which back in the 70s, I'm saying Pavement are doing a similar thing in a way, you know, like Devo playing Led Zeppelin wrong and playing it fast. But I mean, obviously the guitarist is fantastic to play, but it would really annoy people into classic rock, and that's always a good thing to do. It's always good to annoy just wonderful, you know, because you should always have to jab the stuff that came around before, don't you? So, you know, so Devo playing Dazed and Confused way too fast, but really well, and Pavement quoting people from prog rock bands. I just like it because it kind of needles people. It just sounds really good as well.
It sounds really good, and if it annoys people along the way, it's perfect for me. Here's Pavement.